Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel Lehman. Today we're going to talk about ADD and actually why I care about it, why I care about it so much. So I am a child psychiatrist by training, and 50% of the kids that I see in my practice, or people we've actually seen at Amen clinics, have ADD of one form or another. But as I was learning about ADD and learning about imaging, especially a study called quantitative EEG, my tendency is like do it on all the people in my family so that I could learn about it. And when I first did it on my son, who was 11 at the time, and smart and was getting A's in school, his quantitative EEG totally showed up like he had ADD. And then I went, it made total sense to me, and I was really irritated with myself that I hadn't figured it out for him, because a half an hour of homework would take him an hour to do, with his mother yelling and screaming at him to get it done. And his room always followed the second law of physics, which is entropy. Things go from order to disorder. In fact, sometimes I'd look at him and I'd go, how did this room get so messy? When I would go in and clean it with him, and his handwriting was not good, common in ADD. And I remember one time in the third grade, I'd go to his classroom and I looked at all the desks and they were neat in a row, except this one desk was sort of off to the side with stuff hanging out. And it just, my heart sank, because I knew it was his desk and I was right. I adopted Anthony, and so of course I think I'm biologically clean of this stuff, because ADD is totally a genetic disorder. And my first biological child, Breanne, was always easy, always sweet. And then Caitlin came along. So they were all 5 years apart, and Caitlin was hyperactive from before birth. She was so active inside her mother's womb, we thought she was going to be a boy, but she wasn't. And busy, oh my goodness. Where Breanne would just sit in my lap, and for that matter, Anthony would sit in my lap and I'd read stories to them. Caitlin was just everywhere. She'd be hanging over the side of the chair, she'd be crawling on my head. And I'm like, where are you going? She, holding that child when she was a year old was literally like trying to hold a large, live, floppy fish. I mean, it's just, she's so active. I had a spiritual crisis over this child. I remember where we were living at the time, we were going to this Catholic church, and Catholic churches have this terrible idea of taking little kids into church with you. And I remember growing up, and my mother would have all 7 of us sitting, except my older ADD brother. He would always be wiggling, but everybody else would be sitting still. And when I would take Caitlin to church, she was always a mess. She was wiggling, she was getting up, she'd run down the aisle. And I remember having to take her out multiple times and threatening her life to behave, and of course it didn't work. And I worried about her soul, go to church, get your life threatened. Pretty soon you don't want to go to church anymore. And it was really bad for me because, I'm the only child psychiatrist in my community. And it's just bad for business if your child is the worst child, as far as behavior in the church. And so for a year, I stopped going to church because I just couldn't handle the stress. And I remember, I'm like, all right, I'm gonna leave her and I'm gonna pray for a healing. I believe in healings. And so I'd go back to church, I'd light candles at church, I put extra money with the candles thinking I could bribe God. Because what a lot of people don't know, 30% of 3-year-olds look hyperactive. Only 5 to 10% of 4-year-olds. So the first time you can really diagnose ADD, unless you're a highly skilled child psychiatrist, is about 4 years old. And so when she's 3, I'm lighting candles, I write the Pope, and, could we get a blessed picture, put it by her bed, and he must have had an ADD secretary because nobody wrote me back. At the time, I was living in Northern California, and I wrote a column in the local newspaper where I used to live. And so when I would go out, people would recognize me. And if they wouldn't have recognized me, Caitlin would have been on a leash. So I really understand the stress that parents go through. And as I have my own hyperactive child at home, and now I see the ADD, ADHD kids at work, I totally have empathy for them. And so, but I still can't have her on a little yellow leash because people recognize me, and that makes me feel self-conscious. And so what I used to do when I took her to the mall is I would put her in her stroller and tie her shoes together so she couldn't get out. And the first time I did that, she just had such a fit. But I mean, I'm keeping her safe. And when you have a hyperactive child and you go to the grocery store, it's like, oh my goodness. So she went in the cart. I don't want to go in the cart. I don't care. You're going in the cart. But I don't want to go in the cart. Doesn't matter. Boom, in the cart. And at the time, I was actually teaching parent training, and I became such a better teacher because my level of empathy went way up. And it's because I was a teacher that I didn't beat this child, because the frustration is awful. And so you need to have skill, more skill than you just get from watching your parents parent. And so on her 4th birthday, because she's still really hyperactive, I take her to see a friend of mine who's a psychologist. And she goes, oh, she has ADHD. She was the hyperactive form of this for sure. It's fairly rare in girls. And oppositional defiant disorder, so ODD. She'll love all these letters. ADD, ODD, but Caitlin, when she was a little girl, her first word was no. Her first short sentence was no way. Her first long sentence was, you can't make me do it. The level of opposition, I'm so happy that I had training on how to deal with it. Now, when the psychologist who diagnosed her did her history, she looked at me and she looked at her mother, and she basically said, who has it? Because ADD runs in families. You get it from your mother, you get it from your father, it comes from your mother's side or your father's side. And for me, I'm like, well, obviously it's not me, although thinking about the hyperactive brother that I have, and I have stories on my older brother. Couldn't stay in the house. My parents would find him out in the gutter. He would draw on the walls, and he beat me up all the time, be that as it may. I was focused in school. I did fine in school. Actually really good in college and medical school. And then, she looked at Caitlin's mother, and Caitlin's mother was obviously not me. And then she asked her mother the famous question, which is, you're in college, right? And her mother said, yes. How long have you been in college? She said, about 10 years. And she said, tell me how you study. She said, oh, I can never study at home. I get too distracted by all the things going on. I'd have to go inside my little car, underneath a street lamp, no kids, no noise, nothing there I can study. And when Caitlin's mother was diagnosed with ADD, it so explained a lot of the stress in my life. So my oldest son has it, my youngest daughter has it, my wife has it. I'm surrounded by it. So I know more about it than I want to know. And then I'm doing imaging. It's the most interesting, important thing, it seems, for me to image, because I can totally relate to it. It's a huge part of my practice in my life. And then it's 1997. So we've been doing imaging for 6 years, and I'm beginning to get really worried about Breanne. Breanne is my middle daughter, always easy, always sweet. But the truth about Breanne, and this is going to sound terrible to you, and it hurts my feelings when I say it, is I used to think she wasn't very bright. And I mean, if you saw a picture of her, she's beautiful and ever so sweet. But I had to teach her the same thing over and over and over again. And I'm like, why isn't she getting it? And in 3rd grade, I brought her to see the same psychologist who tested her, because I'm worried she has learning disabilities. She's not at all hyperactive and not really disorganized. And when I took her to see this psychologist in 3rd grade, she said, she doesn't have learning disabilities. And she basically told me she wasn't very bright. You know, she tested with an IQ of about 90, and she said, well, because she's in this, you know, high-achieving family, that you have high expectations for her, but she'll be okay, is what she said, because Breanne has a very high work ethic. She tries really hard. In fact, in 8th grade, Breanne won a Presidential Scholar Award, not for academics, but for effort. Breanne she'd never gotten 1A in her life, but she tries really hard. And it's like, well, how can you not love a child like that? And she worked hard, and she got B's and C's, and in 10th grade, things just fell apart for her. She was staying up every night till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning to get her homework done. And I would try to help her, and I remember this one time she was studying genetics and biology, and she just didn't get it. And we would work, and she'd stay up every night till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and I could just begin to see she was becoming depressed. She was becoming worn out. And then one night she came to me in tears, and she said, Dad, I don't think I can ever be as smart as my friends. And it just broke my heart. And I remembered that in 1991, when I started doing imaging, I scanned everybody I knew, including my children. And so I went and I looked at her scan the next day at work, and I was horrified by what I saw, because it was really low in activity. So in 1991, when I first started doing imaging, I didn't have any experience in looking at scans. And so maybe I'd seen 50 scans, but now in 1997, I'd seen 5,000 scans. And when I looked at it, I just cried, because I had been helping all these people, and someone I loved most in the world was suffering, and it just made me feel awful. So I went home that night, and I said, sweetie, I'm very concerned. I'm concerned about how you're doing in school. I know you try really hard. And so I looked at your original scan, and I didn't like it. It was low in activity. I want to do another one. And because the scans involve this little tiny needle in a vein in your arm, she's like, I don't want to do a scan. She said, Dad, all you think about are scans, which is probably true. But I'm a child psychiatrist. I know how to get my way with children. And I said, Breanne, this is really important. What'll it take? And she looked at me, she said, a phone line in my room. And I'm thinking to myself, maybe she's smarter than I think. And so she got the phone lines before the age of cell phones, and we scanned her the next day. And her scan was terrible. It just showed really low activity, especially in the front part of her brain, and in her temporal lobe. So really low activity. And we often see sort of this global low activity in people who have what we call inattentive ADD. And I just wept when I saw it. I just felt so awful. And I went home that night and I said, sweetie, it's the same as before. I want to do one more scan. And then you see her eyes get all really big and crazy on medicine. Medicine? I'm not taking medicine and you can't make me. And I'm like, this is this very lovely, sweet child who now just had a total freak out because she said, I'm not like Caitlin. And from the time Caitlin was 1, she and Breanne had been at war, because when you have ADD, it's often associated with conflict-seeking, drama-driven behavior, and so they're always pushing each other's buttons. In fact, they stayed in the same room, and thought just came to me. I remember Caitlin's crib had a net over the top of it. Now, why would you put a net over the top of a crib? Because otherwise Caitlin was crawling out of it, and I was worried to death that she was going to have a head injury. And then she would stand at the crib and shake the crib. I remember I was thinking, the crib is going to fall apart. And so anyways, fast forward to now, Breanne's 15 and Caitlin's 10, and Breanne's like, I'm not taking medicine and you can't make me. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm a child psychiatrist. I know how to get my way with children. Breanne, what'll it take? One more scan on a low dose of medicine. I want a TV in my room, which is something I'm totally opposed to for children. And I think we negotiated for something else. The next day, on 10 milligrams of Ritalin, her scan normalized. And I kept Breanne in the clinic so I could show her the scans. And I said, come here, sit next to me. Here's your scan from yesterday, really low. Here's your scan from today. Do you see? She goes, well, you're going to give me some of this medicine, aren't you? She said, I can already tell the difference. I feel more energy. I can focus. In the concentration test we gave her to do the scan, she had already performed better. And so no argument from her. Because basically, if you look at her scans, the question is, which brain do you want? Do you want the one that's not working right, or do you want the one that's working right? And the result was truly miraculous. A week later, she and I went out to dinner together, and I'm like, so how's it going? She's like, Dad, you can't believe it. I'm like, what? She said, I think I'm going to be a geneticist. I'm like, what? She said, well, don't you think it's the future? I can actually see the DNA molecule rotate in my head. I'm like, oh my God. 3 months later, straight A's. The next 10 years, virtually straight A's. And she got into one of the best veterinarian schools in the world. She got into the University of Edinburgh. And I don't know if you know, but getting into veterinarian school is harder than getting into medical school. I remember, 4 or 5 months later, I went to Israel to give a talk at an international ADD meeting, and I decided to take her with me. And she took her medicine before we took off, and literally 10 hours she's doing her homework. And I just leaned over, I said, so what do you think about all this? She's like, Dad, it's unbelievable. She said, I used to hate school because I couldn't do it. And it made me feel bad about me. She said, I used to get very religious in class. I'm like, what do you mean? She said, I used to pray to God that the teacher wouldn't call on me because I was always lost. I never wanted to be lost, but I was always lost. And an hour class seemed like it would take 8 hours, and it was just so hard. She said, now that hour class seems like it goes by in 15 minutes, and I love it because I can do it. I remember one time at dinner with her, and if you met her, she's an introverted, shy child. And she would never raise her hand in class because she was lost. And then, so one day at dinner, I look over and she winks at me. And she said, "I kicked butt in a debate today, Dad." And I'm like, who is this child? And you could just see her level of confidence go up. That she does not feel less than other people. That she is not condemned to a life of mediocrity, a life of feeling not that smart. I know a lot about ADD. And my first marriage didn't work. And my second one, so Tana and I actually did my last PBS special together, our special, Healing ADD. And as I really like this woman, and I'm like, and she's describing her mother who has ADD, her uncle who has ADD, and I'm like, seriously, God. But she gets it treated, and it works. Because what a lot of people don't know is that people who have ADD are often the CEOs in our world. They're often highly intelligent, driven people that when they surround themselves with people who organize them, they can be awesome. And one more story, just to tell you, I know more about this than I want to. When I first opened our Southern California clinic, I almost didn't, because my family lives in Southern California, and I went, you know, if I open a clinic down there, I'm going to spend all my time with my family. And I'm looking for property, you know, for a place to live. And I get a call from my sister that my niece has a knife to her arm. And I'm like, oh my God. And I'm like, no, we need to scan my niece. And she's someone who struggled with her behavior. And I thought her brain would be really busy just because of, you know, me witnessing her behavior over the years. But I was wrong. She had really low activity in her brain. And she was struggling in school despite being very bright. And when I scanned her, she had really low activity. It was the drama-driven, excitement-seeking behavior. And on the right medicine and supplements, normalized. No more of that sort of crazy behavior. Went on to get all A's and B's in high school, straight A's in college, and is just the most awesome adult. You are not stuck with the brain you have. I'm so excited about helping people who have ADD. It's personal to me. I know it can devastate your life if left untreated. I get furious when I hear, in fact, I was at a conference recently with a friend, and he was like, oh, everybody's putting their kids on medication, doing that whole popular societal thing to bash people who have ADD or people that are taking medication. And only by random chance he called on me. And I'm like, nah, let me help you with the message. Having untreated ADD is devastating. 35% of people never finish high school. 52% of untreated ADD teenagers and adults have problems with substance abuse. There's a higher incidence of divorce, incarceration, financial failure, job failure. Now we know obesity, diabetes, and Alzheimer's disease. Left untreated, it devastates people's lives. And I actually look back at my kid's mom, and you can see the devastation in her family, where 4 of her 5 uncles had problems with alcohol abuse, and there was also issues with domestic violence. And so ADD is real, and when it is left untreated, it causes real problems in people's lives, yet it is treatable. And often, if you just think of Breanne, left untreated, condemned to a life of failure and mediocrity, with treatment, can thrive because she has more access to her own brain.